Are you standing there the whole time? Really dedicated, thank you. All right, good evening, everyone. How are you all today? Good. Yeah, thank you for making it through to the last session of the day. My name is Kim Ross, and I'm co-executive director and co-founder of Rethink Energy Florida, and I'm chair of the Upper Limit Project Steering Committee. Now, I was originally supposed to be the moderator with two excellent and well-known speakers, not that we are not excellent, but the well-known piece. However, Rafe Pomerantz, the founder of this project and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Environment and Development, had some health issues that came up in the last 2 weeks, causing him to have to cancel his trip. And then Dr. Sarah Doss of Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute also found herself unable to attend. So we have recordings of them that we'll be playing in just a bit, but let me first set the stage. We'll hear from Dr. Sarah Doss by video, and then Rafe Pomerantz, and then our communications director, Kara Fleischer, will close out the conversation discussing the upper limit as a communications tool before we open the floor for discussions, reactions, and questions. One initial stage-setting mention: the Upper Limit Project is first and foremost a communications tool. Lots of research, modeling, and data has been collected, done, and observed, which lends itself to developing more information to share. But until and unless the public understands what they are looking at, and until and unless policymakers take action to address climate change and its impacts, we are looking at those impacts worsening over time with no end in sight. Now I get to figure out how to move this. So, the Upper Limit Project came into existence as a project in Florida. And one thing that we can tell you about Florida is that while it might be run by a climate change denier, they are paying attention to sea level rise. The governor and the supermajority Republican legislature are putting money into adapting to it, to the tune of more than $1.8 billion. Cities and counties are investing as well. If Florida is to continue in its present state, adaptation has to occur. But for those of us who work in climate change, and particularly for those who work at the city or county level, the question becomes, how much sea level rise are we adapting to? And what are we doing to limit the rate of sea level rise from rising quickly beyond what it's currently adapting to? So as we began to bring people into these conversations, we of course realized that this is an issue that goes far beyond Florida, and it turned out there's a lot of interest in other states and in other countries, in coastal cities and countries that are around the world. A focus on sea level rise is something that for the 30% of the global population that lives within 50 kilometers of the coast is very tangible. And then we bring in the conversation around ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica, because the loss or the diminishing of the ice in Greenland and Antarctica is really where the major impacts will be felt. Now, when we submitted this as a proposal topic for AGU as a town hall, Greenland was very much in the American news. Our president wanted to purchase it or take it over. So while we're focused on Greenland, and Dr. Sarah Doss, I'll be showing her video in just a moment. She's the polar and climate scientist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. She'll be speaking about Greenland. Just know that there's a similar conversation happening around Lake Antarctica. So without further ado, Dr. Sarah Doss.
So now to talk a little bit more about Greenland specifically. One thing I think is an important point to make is that it's really been in my lifetime that Greenland has changed from a relatively stable state where its ice sheet is what we call in balance. So the snow coming in is matched by the ice melt and the calving going out. That's really changed in my lifetime from this stable balance to a rapid and accelerated decline. And what's shown here in the blue curve, now looking back to about the early 1970s, is this relatively stable state. You see this flat blue curve at the top of the screen, and then around the 1990s, you start to see this rapid sort of plunging decline. And this is indicative of what we call the cumulative mass change in gigatons of ice. So year on year, how much ice from Greenland is being lost, and how that is accumulated year after year, and resulting in sea level rise. And this is taking us all the way up through the present, and is a process that is ongoing. Again, in response to this warming, not only in the atmosphere, but as well in the ocean. I'm going to now zoom in to a slightly higher resolution view of that same mass loss process in Greenland to start to give you a picture of what that looks like across the entire continent. Greenland is a massive island. It's covered by an ice sheet that's over 2 miles thick in its interior. I've found almost impossible to help people understand how large Greenland is and how much ice is held up in it. But this will give you a sense for where the ice loss is most dramatic. So I'm going to play an animation, and what you're going to see in the blue line is this mass loss, again, now starting in 2002 when we were doing satellite observations through to 2022, just as far as this animation goes, but this loss continues. And you'll see on the ice sheet image on the left, colors start to fill in. The darker red colors indicate where you have the most ice mass being lost over time. So you start to see that it's around the edges, the margins of Greenland, where most of this ice loss is occurring. And that's because the edges of Greenland are where the ice is lower, and so it's exposed to warmer temperatures in the atmosphere. It's also around the edges where you have large ice streams or glaciers that are coming into contact with the warming ocean. And as this warming ocean interacts with the front of these glaciers, you also have things like calving, large pieces of ice breaking off. And that has a ripple effect where it extends farther into the interior of Greenland and draws that ice out more quickly. And so this fingerprint that we were left with at the end really illustrates that around almost all of Greenland, ice is being lost year after year. And it's not being replenished at a rate that keeps it in balance. And so it's this overall ice loss that's leading to sea level rise. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this figure. I could spend an entire semester teaching you about the fundamentals of ice sheet research and how ice sheets work. But I want to just show this figure quickly because we're now taking a cutaway view of the ice sheet. So I mentioned how the interior of Greenland is about 2 miles thick. And what we're really looking at here is all the different kinds of processes and scales of processes that as scientists we need to understand when we're trying to understand why the ice is growing or shrinking and how it's changing over time. So we need to measure things like the rate of snowfall to the top of the ice sheet. We need to understand melting around the edges like we showed in the satellite images. We need to understand how the ice is moving. So ice deforms internally, it's squished under its own weight, it's pouring out towards the edges of Greenland. It's also sliding along the base. When you have water that's getting through the ice sheet, the ice is actually sliding along the bedrock below. And then again, you have these processes at the edges where the ocean comes into contact, breaking off pieces of the ice. So all these pieces need to be summed up together, and these are things that scientists are doing important work on. I want to show just a few pictures here. I've done a lot of work in Greenland. As Margaret mentioned, I've led over 20 expeditions both to Greenland and Antarctica, and we're really trying to understand what's happening. We can put out instrumentation, we can collect samples, we can do all sorts of important work by being on the ground. And I just want to illustrate what does melting Greenland look like when you're in Greenland. So this is an example of a large meltwater stream. 2 of my colleagues are up on the edge of this canyon, just to give you a sense of the dramatic landscape and what these large melt features look like as Greenland is melting around its edges. This is another expedition we led to one of the fjords up around a calving glacier that's pouring off the Greenland ice sheet. And here we're working with some new instrumentation to try to understand how the warming ocean interacts with the ice front and how these two things play together to also eat away and carve away at the melting ice. But Greenland is not just melting on the surface and at the edges where it meets the ocean, it's also melting in the interior in places where it's still cold enough that this meltwater is refrozen within the snowpack on the surface. But this allows us to look back in time and see how unprecedented the rapid rates of warming and melting are today by using tools such as drilling ice cores. We can peer back in time. I'm now showing an ice core from near the interior of Greenland, where we can look, these darker bands are actually showing us where ice has melted and refrozen into the firn. And this is occurring over wider and wider areas and more frequently. The main point here is that polar ice loss is going to continue to accelerate, and these large ice sheets this loss is really irreversible. So as more of Greenland melts away, more of Antarctica melts away, driven by this warming air and atmosphere, even once we stabilize temperatures, and I'm confident that we will, these ice sheets will not grow back. So we're committing future generations for hundreds, thousands of years to the amount of ice loss that we are driving today. But as I mentioned at the top, this future of Greenland melt is not written in stone. Our choices and our actions today have an enormous part to play on what future scenarios will look like. I'm showing here on the left, this is a plot of future Greenland melt projections from the 1990s. The gray line is observations, and then we see color curves of the different emission scenarios. One to the mid-century, and the right-hand panel to the end of the century, what the different sea level contributions look like if we reach lower, middle, or higher emission scenarios. I'm not going to focus too much on the exact numbers here, but I want you to understand that the difference between, for example, the low and the high emission scenarios is about a doubling of Greenland melt from mid-century going forward. So these are the kinds of tools we can use to help us understand the implications for the energy and emission decisions that we're making.
All right.
So now,
So this is actually a statement that Rafe Pomerantz loves to talk about. The fate of Greenland is the fate of Florida. And the Greenland ice sheet holds enough water to raise the sea level by 23 feet. That is centuries in the distance, right? Full 23 feet. But it is still enough to be alarmed and enough to be concerned about what's happening and what's happening now. And of course, all of these things, which she was about to go into, are all of the impacts, right? And the things that we're seeing now that show you that sea level rise is here now. There's flooding of homes and energy facilities and hazardous waste in the United States, 3,740 facilities at risk for a 100-year event in 2050. And that's with pledged commitments to reduce carbon emissions. And then the fiscal challenges are immense. In Florida and in many other places, this is most pronounced currently in the pullout of the insurance market. In Florida, we have several companies that are just not doing any new ones or sometimes pulling out from insuring at all in the state of Florida. And I've definitely heard that from other areas around the country. But in addition to that, the costs to adapt are immense as well. Even though we've already put $1.8 billion into adaptation statewide, the costs anticipated for Miami alone are around $4 billion. And finally, in Florida, which is highly reliant on property tax, and this is going to, of course, be similar to anywhere where property tax makes up a lot of the local revenue. But in Florida, we are heavily reliant on property tax. These revenues are going to dry up and create even more vulnerability. So the proposal for the upper limit proposal is to add a second metric by which we talk about climate change, and that is sea level rise. The Paris Agreement, 1.5 degrees Celsius, is vital, but it's not widely understood. And the use of a second metric would compel people to confront the climate emergency and spur the public and governments into action. And let me just mention, for those of you who walked in a little bit late, that the founder of this is Mr. Rafe Pomerantz, able to be here today, but here is a recording of him.
The world is not making sufficient progress on climate change, not making sufficient progress on lowering the rates of emissions, not making sufficient progress in holding on to the global temperatures, and we came up with this idea that the world right now has one metric, which is global temperature. That's what's in the Paris Accord. And we thought that adding a second metric to that could motivate policy in a big way. So we decided to put a proposal on the table, which we call the upper limit to sea level rise. Let us establish an upper limit. How high is too high? Where will we allow the world to go? And we thought that adding such a second metric into the climate world on a global basis might drive policy. And we used sort of in our minds, we worked this out in Florida, where we thought, ask your public official, how high is too high? How far are you willing to let this go? And which then would provide public officials with the rationale to really take on more radical and important policy measures, because they could point to sea level rise impacts, which Sarah laid out, which affect so many millions of people and is so costly. So the idea was move beyond the global temperature regime, is the only metric, and establish a second metric, which we thought might move policy. And in that process, we started to try to sell this in Florida. We're still selling it, still in the early stages. But we realized that there's the global potential for this. There's a big market for allies and others with this idea. And we ended up making various presentations to delegations at the General Assembly special session in September. They had a full day on sea level rise. And we continue to try to find allies. Now, I'll give you an example here. Sarah's presentation on the state of Massachusetts is impressive. So, what might the officials of Massachusetts do, in addition to what they're already doing, a lot of great work? We think they could consider adopting the idea of an upper limit to sea level rise. And then that's an overall comprehensive proposal to carry this forward, in which they could build allies with other governors, not federal government U.S. right now, but potentially other nations. Because it's obviously in the long-term interests of Massachusetts to reduce the rate of increase as much as possible. And in order to do that, you need global action. In order to get global action, you need all kinds of allies. So, that's the idea for the upper limit. Bring it even to the negotiations that occur annually of the climate, of governments involved in the climate issue, and establish an upper limit to sea level rise. That debate, if it took place, would then, it would sort of, Sarah's presentation would be the governments would have to stare at the potential impacts, right there on the floor of the convention and negotiations, and we think that could move policy. It gives, as I said earlier, politicians a rationale and even protection for taking strong measures. Now, the definition in the upper limit is sort of interesting that we came up with, because you can't stop sea level rise right away. There's too much warming built into the planet at this point. But what you can do is lower the rate of increase, as the graphs that Sarah presented demonstrate. There's different paths forward in the world, and if governments manage to get down to the lowest rates of emissions, you then get the lowest rates of sea level rise, for starters. And we again think that the sea level rise can motivate the kinds of changes that could drive emissions down. global temperature is a great metric, but it's pretty obscure for most people. They don't know what it means, 1.5 degrees centigrade. What does that mean to me? But sea level rise means something important to the hundreds of millions of people ultimately who are affected. The second part of the definition, so the first part is lowest possible rate of increase. The second part is to stop the disintegration of the ice sheets in A, Greenland, and B, Antarctica, because there is so much potential sea level rise. It's catastrophic if we allow global temperatures to continue to rise, and ultimately you start to lose major pieces of Greenland and Antarctica. The consequences are devastating on a global basis. So we wanted to give more prominence to the ice sheets.
All right. So just so you have a visual, this is a chart from NASA. But basically, it's a rate, right? We started out really wanting a number. 2 feet is too much, sounded like a great number. But the reality is that sea level rise is not going to ever stop. So, what we're proposing as the upper limit is basically the rate that's equivalent to what we would need to do to stay at 1.5 degrees Celsius. So, as I mentioned before, we are at the point where this is mostly a communications project, and so I'm going to turn things over here to our communications director, Ms. Kara Fleischer. I'll be driving for her. So.
Thanks, Kim. Hello, everyone. I'm Kara Fleischer, Communications Director for the Upper Limit Project. Thank you for coming to our presentation and staying late to be with us. Abraham Lincoln said, "Public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed." We have a communications problem when it comes to explaining the specific risks of especially sea level. 40% of the world's population lives along the coastlines, making them densely populated with significant economic activity, and yet our leaders failed to act to reduce the risk of climate-caused sea level rise. That's why Rafe Pomerantz, a leader in climate policy for 5 decades, and our coalition of climate scientists and communication leaders created the Upper Limit Project. We believe this communications tool can compel people to act on controlling the climate emergency to save their coastal towns. Millions of articles and tens of thousands of scientific papers are written annually, but the public is still not demanding change en masse. The science community is doing great work, and climate impact information is everywhere. So why isn't climate action a #1 voting issue? Misinformation, disinformation, apathy, and lack of feeling the impacts personally are the main factors. We need to build political will for climate action. Many people don't understand 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature goals of the Paris Agreement, especially in the United States, where Fahrenheit is used and the politics are divisive. The public is bombarded and they are tuning out. If we can help connect the dots that climate change caused sea level rise is already causing flooding during high tides, and that seas will continue to rise, we can make climate science personal for the 130 million Americans who live along the coast and the 3.3 billion coastal dwellers worldwide. Some might be surprised that 73% of people living in Ruby Red, Florida, believe that global warming is happening, according to the Yale Program for Climate Change Communication. Of those, only 58% of Floridians think global warming is affecting rising sea levels. This was the lowest response to the questions posed, and provides an opportunity to help connect the tangible experience of flooding with climate impacts projected to come. Sea level rise threatens 16.2 million people living near the coast of Florida, 76% of our population there. So the question is, how much is too much? How much can communities withstand if they've already had 1 foot and so much more is on the way? An upper limit is an opportunity to connect climate-caused sea level rise in coastal areas to the tangible impact of flooding that many people already experience with king tides, rainstorms, and hurricanes. And we know the impacts of flooding in Florida. During king tides and after large rain events, South Florida has already experienced damaging flooding. In 2024, Trident Pier, Florida hit 18 high tide flood days, and reports show increasing sunny day tidal flooding across the state. These are linked to rising sea levels that amplify the impact of normal high tides and will continue to be more frequent. These photos were taken of the Fort Lauderdale flooding of April 2023 by our Upper Limit Project member Stella Nunez's mother, who was stranded inside her car in the floodwaters for over 4 hours. Sea level rise plus hurricane storm surge equals extreme devastation. Sea level rise with storm surge has always been a huge concern. Hurricanes Ian and Helene drove home the point. These pictures are from our climate advocate and Upper Limit Project member Susan Glickman of her own personal home that was flooded by the storm surge during Hurricane Helene and her own car that was damaged in Hurricane Milton. This is hitting close to home. So to recap, the Upper Limit Project provides a way to spur political action by focusing on tangible losses caused by sea level rise, including loss of coastal land and beaches, infrastructure, including flooding of roads, hazardous sites, and waste treatment facilities, saltwater intrusion into freshwater supplies, loss of property values, displacement of millions of people leading to an economic and insurance crisis, climate gentrification with making property on higher ground more desirable, obvious severe impacts on tourism dollars, and ultimately leaving many coastal communities underwater. But it's not too late to avoid the worst impacts from climate-caused sea level rise. And governments around the world must act to reduce this oncoming harm to coastal communities. And with that in mind, I'll turn it back over to Kim.
All right. So we had a retreat earlier this year, folks that are on the Upper Limit Project, and realized a few things. The United States is host for next year's G20 summit. And President Trump decided of all the places to host it, he would host it in Miami. Miami is ground zero. Miami is ground zero for the sea level rise in the United States. One of the ground zeros, I should say. It's not the only ground zero. And our Florida team has several connections to local leaders in Miami. In addition, the G20 itself is collectively responsible for 78% of greenhouse gas emissions. So our goal with this new campaign, the G20 campaign, is to drive enough awareness with both an internal strategy. We have someone that's on the steering committee that is part of the Oceans 20 track of the G20, and with both an internal strategy as well as a public strategy to raise the awareness and the urgency of sea level rise. Now, with President Trump setting the agenda, it's unlikely that sea level rise will officially be on the agenda. But with the right local, state, national, and international partners, we can drive the conversation and the media narrative. So we're about to get to the point where we're gonna open for questions and discussion. But I wanted to share this with you. That QR code takes you to our website as well as the website itself. I do have some of those postcards, and I also have, if anyone is from an organization where they might be interested in partnering, I have more information on that G20 campaign. And I think we're going to let, before we do questions and discussion, we'll let Kara close us out.
Thank you. So Barack Obama once said, "We did not come here to fear the future, we came here to shape it." Flooding from rising seas is altering people's livelihoods and living spaces, robbing our children's futures of livable coastlines. And the time is now for leadership to reshape this narrative by setting an upper limit to the lowest possible rate of sea level rise. To spur governments and the public to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and slow sea level rise for a more livable world. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, we want to open the floor. So, town halls, why we brought this as a town hall is because we want your feedback, we want your information, we want your thoughts, and of course we want any questions. And any questions that I can't answer because our speakers originally scheduled were not able to be here, I'm happy to get your contact information and take back. And by that, I'm specifically referring to Sarah Doss, since she was our scientist scheduled to be here. So, but please, the mic is right there. Any questions or comments or thoughts?
Thank you. Oh, Derek Sharp, Colorado State University. How does Governor DeSantis square spending all this money on adaptation and, or adaptation, I guess, for something that he doesn't see as a real problem? Does he just write it off as natural variation?
I have to ask Governor DeSantis about that, but I would say he's very focused on what's occurring and adapting to it, right? So he's thinking, okay, it's rising, so we need to put money into stopping it from flooding our streets, or and pumps and natural barriers, and as well as seawalls and those sorts of things. Every solution is on the table for them. But the money, he's not squaring it with, oh, this is going to keep going, and that's the piece that we need to make sure that gets in front of them, is that this is going to keep going until we do the second piece. Now, Florida itself is, I want to say it's 16th or 18th. If we're a country, its GDP would be 16th or 18th in the world. So if Florida were to become a leader in this, right, then it would impact the world. So unfortunately, with the politics the way that they are today, like he released his budget about a week or two ago, and it has some very anti-climate things. When he first took office, I would say he was not an anti-climate change governor. There's a lot of people that are following what they believe to be the will of the base on that. But I think the more that we can amplify this and not make it about parties, but about, hey, this is about the existence of Florida as it exists. This is about Miami not needing to move, right? Those types of things, the better we can really influence the long-term conversation. Although I have to admit, I think we both are at the state of ready for him to leave office, and let's try with the next person. Because he really has, like I said, his budget that he just released was much worse in terms of climate change denialism than anything he's put forth before now. And yet, he spends the money on adapting to sea level rise. And yet, and I will say I also worked at the Department of Environmental Protection before I founded Rethink Energy, actually while I was founding Rethink Energy. And the people that are there are not climate change deniers. So they're doing the best that they can. The people that are within the state government are really doing the best that they can to make sure that things get out and things get addressed. And I'll say that's also true, and I'm happy for someone else to come up to the mic. But I'll also say that's true of some of our more conservative areas around counties around the state. That they're getting the work done. They're not thinking about whether or not it's a party issue or what's happening.
Hi there, my name is Carly. I'm a PhD student working at the University of Buffalo. So I'm a trained geologist, and so I feel like something that I learned in school is that the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets, like the difference between the last ice age and today is only 4 to 5 degrees Celsius global cooling. And so like I can see the magnitude of 1.5 degrees Celsius as being, a fifth of that. That's a pretty big change. And I worry that a similar and so I get that the public is not going to think 1.5 degrees is enough. It's like so what? And I worry that 2 feet, too much kind of thing is similar, and that 2 feet also doesn't sound like that much to someone who doesn't see like the geologic record context of that, or like know the implications of like what it, that rise would be. And I always feel like when I hear people talk about politics, it's that like money talks. And so like, well, have you guys thought about considering asking like risk modelers or something to estimate the cost of 2 feet and put like a limit on like how much you're willing to spend on sea level rise versus how much you want to spend on mitigation? Like humans are so bad at putting money into keeping something from happening because they need to see it happen to know that it's bad. But like, I feel like money might be your best shot of being like, how about we don't spend more than $500 billion on rebuilding the infrastructure in Florida? What if we just spend $100 billion on putting money into renewable energies? I'm curious of your thoughts about that. Thanks for holding this.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great suggestion. We definitely, in Florida, are used to talking about money, primary, first and foremost, when you go to talk to somebody about, in the legislature, which is part of what I do, talking about money and talking about the costs and those sorts of things is definitely something that we go to a lot, so it's a great suggestion. There has been some work that's of course already been done, but to the level that you're talking about, I think that's a good suggestion, that would be good, for sure. Because money does talk.
Good talk. I'm Michael from the University of Arizona. I was wondering, this is a bit more not things we can control on this side, but you have the misinformation actors who are very loud, and they'll scream about how now we call the climate changes as global warming, like, oh, we keep changing the benchmarks. Do you have any concern with adding this other metric that I think would be a good idea, but then like, oh, see, like the temperature increase was a red herring, now they're talking about something else. So how can we like navigate adding these additional factors we need to really worry about without just kind of being yelled into oblivion by these misinformation actors? And thank you.
Thank you.
It's a great question. I would start by referencing Katherine Hayhoe, who has done a lot of work on climate communications. And the bad actors and the real hardcore climate deniers are a much smaller percentage than it feels like they are. They're more like 15%. And so and her advice is to ignore them. So although we're up against a lot of paid misinformation that is pushed hard, we feel like this is a complementary metric to the 1.5 degrees and might have a chance of actually getting some traction because people can picture water around their ankles. They know how high their house flooded. A lot of them have the line, and it's kind of like a badge of honor, of sadness. So that's a great question. I think that we can't let the deniers paralyze us from trying to creatively communicate when other things seem to be stalling. But of course, we always have to be up against that and to push back. And so, we're on socials where we're actively trying to, push the message. But it's a challenge. It's a challenge. They have a lot of money.
And as you're going up, I'll just mention also just in terms of that piece of, we can't let the deniers control or cause us to be frozen, right? That is really that middle ground of people who maybe don't know a lot and are just trying to get through their day and that sort of thing. Those are the people that are really where we want to get, who we want to reach, right? Not the 15% that are fully denial, but the rest, knowing that those guys will probably come along eventually. We just have to, in some ways be louder than them and more creative.
I'm well known to our speakers. I'm Russell Meyer, Director of the Florida Council of Churches. I took 27 inches of water in our Gulf Coast home from a Hurricane Helene 150 miles away. So what does 2 feet of water mean? Because I live on the beach. It means you have no sand on the beach. It means where you used to be able to go out 100 yards, now you can go only half that. Or on the Gulf Coast, it means you lose the beach because the Gulf is very shallow. So 2 feet is very noticeable. Our house was one of the oldest ones in the town, built 75 years ago. It had never flooded. And we took, just like Susan Glickman's home, which was half a mile north of ours, we took water that was absolutely destructive. What does that then mean in state budgets? That means sand re-nourishment on the beach. That means fighting property owners for access to their property. So the electrical inspector came in to do our rough inspection. I put all of our outlets at 4 feet. And he said, "Why did you do that?" I said, "Well, it flooded and it's going to flood again." And he goes, "What makes you think that?" I said, "Well, you know, they have tidal gauges out there. And in the last 2 decades, the base water line has risen almost a foot. So the water's rising and it's not going to stop." And he goes, "Oh, I didn't know." So we're up against disinformation. And the more we can help paint the picture that people may not actually, in Florida, have a beach to go to at 2 feet. As the mayor said earlier today, my fishing camp no longer exists. My beach may not exist anymore. So the metric is very visible for those of us who live on the beach.
Right. I've also had some people say to me, "Oh, why don't you do this metric, or you know, this impact, or that impact, or that impact?" And the reality is, it would be okay to do more than one. Like this is the one that we picked, right? But the more we can, I think, focus on impacts and what that means to people, I think the better. And I also want to say that Russell just gave a very good example of climate communications 101 in terms of just having a story, right? A story to back up the data. That's really important.
No, I appreciated people who live along the coast, make up such a big part of our country and the economy that runs it. And so, coming back to the finances and the personal stories and the livelihoods of folks, really, I think an upper limit would make a difference in having them connect the dots and raising that political will to get governments to act, which is really what it's all about.
Anyone have anything else they'd like to? Go ahead, you can come back.
Just to echo something you've said a couple of times, when you're doing these communications, use English units. Most Americans have no idea centimeters, meters, degrees Celsius.
Absolutely, yeah, sadly, but yes.
Sorry, it's way too in the back.
Okay.
Hi everyone, good evening. My name is Iago, I'm from Florida State. So everything that you guys just said hits way too close to home. Well, first of all, it's a little bit bittersweet that this room is not as filled as it should, considering the magnitude of the problem. But I appreciate everything that you guys are doing. I didn't know about this project, so this was definitely a pleasant surprise. I think that my question is sort of goes in the lines of the questions and comments of other people. What I feel as a researcher, sort of like, almost like at the start of its research career, is that do you think that there is a failure of our way of communicating what we know to the public? Because it feels that there is a disparity about what we know about the importance of of this data and the way that we are communicating that with the public, because these problems have been happening for decades. The data backs up that. It is available, but it's still there, like you mentioned, there seems not to have a public uproar considering the magnitude of the problem. Do you think that there is a more fundamental, basic failure of the way that we are communicating what we know?
I have an answer, maybe you just.
Yeah.
I would not say that there's a failure. I'm also not one to say that there's a failure. I would say that more needs to be done in terms of bringing people in that have the skills for communication, right? Your skills as a researcher are probably not the same as Kara's skills as a communicator. But your skills are incredibly valuable, right? And so there needs to be less silos and more getting together and working together. I was at an earlier town hall where one of the things that was said was, that research projects are starting to have, and have been for a little while now, outreach funds. Outreach and education is part of what you have to do, right? And so bringing in someone who's got that knowledge, or sitting down with the FSU comms people and learning, having them come into some of the classrooms or learning from them, I think would enhance your ability to go in front of the media directly and say something, and also working with someone like Kara or somebody else who's got the skill sets to come together.
Yeah, I would also just add, there's been a lot of research on climate communications specifically, and they found that the human brain has a outrage fatigue and a default to just look away from something that's so existential and so huge. And saying it over and over again doesn't really change that. What they found is people need to feel it personally or hear it from someone they trust, and to make it relate to them. So, we've done all kinds of different communications, like with farmers who have seen the crops change and they can't plant the same things. There's so many examples of the way this impacts people personally, but it's difficult because it's not only outrage fatigue over climate, but then you have all of the other difficult things happening in the world, and people kind of just get in their lanes and say, I'm gonna recycle, and honestly, the oil companies have paid public relations firms for decades to muddle the waters, to confuse the situation, to make it seem like it should be our personal responsibility to change instead of having government action. And so, my feeling as a communicator is to talk about it, which I will say again, Catherine Hayhoe's book, Saving Us, is excellent. It's about communication, and she's a climate scientist in Texas. And she talks a lot about, her main message is talk about it. People feel like it's too polarizing, but once they start talking about it, they realize the other people are concerned too, and it can grow from there. And so really normalizing the fact that we are seeing these changes, we are concerned. We have eco-anxiety is a main cause of mental health problems in young people now. So this isn't going away. So, but I do agree that the communication piece has been not given the same emphasis. And it turns out that to get people to be climate voters, they have to care about this stuff and understand it. So that's what we're hoping the upper limit can help do, is make this tangible.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you guys for doing this. I'm Allie Rollinger. I'm a professor at Mississippi State University. I'm down on the coast in Biloxi, and I run a sea level rise adaptation and resilience program in the Gulf. So this is what I do day in and day out. And so one of the big challenges that I have found in my work is I've been trying to focus on, communicating with people who are disengaged with this topic, and the need for the trusted messengers on a hyper-local level. So I'm just wondering, I am a team of like 6 people and doing all this work, and that there's just never enough of us in doing that. So I'm wondering how y'all are approaching and tackling this need to really be local and place-based, and if that's coming up a lot in doing your work.
So first, yes, and yeah, my organization has a different project where we actually hired from within the communities as the trusted messengers to be able to get our message out. I would say what our plan is more than anything, because we're still kind of at the let's shape this, and especially as we head toward this new campaign with the G20, is to really partner with local organizations that are on the ground that have those connections, right? Because we have the folks of us that are with Rethink Energy Florida, and in Florida, and then we have a few folks that are at kind of thinking at the national and international level, right? So Rethink Energy Florida isn't going to be able to come into Biloxi, Mississippi, and say, all right, let's let's go. And but you've got those resources, and so yeah, we're over the next 3 to 4 months. That's our plan, is to really recruit local leaders and local organizations that can help connect people and really get that message to the right hands. Because you're absolutely right, it's the messenger in the end that matters a lot. Okay. All right. Anything else?
Great questions.
Great questions, great discussion. Thank you guys very much. I'm happy to have I've got cards and the postcards from and I'm happy to have a longer conversation with anybody. Thank you all for being here, and y'all have a wonderful night.